All right, welcome aboard for another ICS Defense Force episode. Today we're going to talk about and kind of clue up some of the episodes we've had in the past, going through a tabletop for an incident response for industrial control environment. So again, welcome aboard. And of course, as we get started, anything we talk about in defense episodes, it's all going to be about applicability to all the sectors that you're going to see here. So let's walk through today's episode, what to expect from today. And also I'll pose these questions that we'll answer throughout the session. As we go through, any questions that you have, pop those into the comments area as well. So when was the last time your organization and the ICS side did an ICS specific tabletop incident response exercise? Was it in the last year or last 15 months or so? Also, how did you generate the tabletop scenario? Kind of a spoiler alert, was it generated from threat intelligence specific to your sector? More on that later. And again, have the lessons learned from that ICS tabletop you've conducted, have those things been applied today? Okay, so all about tabletops. We're going to get into some of the benefits that are quite clear, a lot of return of investment with tabletops specifically. We will talk about the planning as well, preparing for a tabletop, and the applicability as well for practical scenarios and walkthrough. So we do have a selected walkthrough for us specific for the ICS environment from threat intelligence. So that's coming up in just a second. Obviously, the benefits are clear and they are as follows. When doing an exercise at tabletop, you're going to get things like an understanding of improved detection capabilities. The gaps that you'll find in data sources you'll want to be there during an incident will bubble to the top. Beyond that, as you go through, of course, the ramifications of possible safety impacts with the malware and frameworks we're seeing out there, that will become quite clear as well. So a lot of things will flow from validating your incident response readiness into also, based on the teams you have in the tabletop with you, the awareness around the capabilities of ICS attacks that we're seeing out there. Now, beyond this, again, is improving that aspect of detection as we kind of go through. So again, a sort of a spoiler alert, network intrusion detection systems and network visibility for ICS will become very apparent as a critical requirement for tabletops and in practice. So the planning aspect, realizing we do have a ton of benefits. How do we start going about a tabletop? Scenario is only one piece of it, and that's critical, but we have to select the teams that will participate in the tabletop as well. Who is going to be responsible for the different aspects of incident response we've covered in previous episodes, which we'll step through as well. Now, of course, it's important to have an updated incident response plan for this, but don't be worried. That will probably get updated again as a result of the lessons learned from this tabletop. Now, one thing I want to point out is the safety and emergency response in most engineering industrial control system environments is probably already established. That's going to be a safety and emergency response for physical controls at the site, physical incidents that may have occurred or could occur in the future as well. So they probably have some kind of procedure already documented and wrapped around that. So it's an opportunity as you plan your incident response for ICS from a cyber perspective to obviously engage with that team. They might have things you can leverage already, and maybe it's just an opportunity to tie in the cyber aspect into the existing safety and emergency response as well. As we go through, the defensible cyber position, which is something you can do to contain the environment, will become clear. All right. As we push through the ICS incident response, we are well aware of the prep phase, the detection phase, evidence acquisition, time-critic analysis, the containment, as well as eradication. Lessons learned and information sharing will become apparent as we go through. So where do we get our scenario? We're going to specifically leverage threat intelligence from the ICS area. And if we take a look at the threat intel that's out there, we know ICS attacks commonly begin in the IT environment. Beyond that, the ICS attacks usually can pivot from IT into the industrial control system environments through trusted assets, data historians, and other assets as well. We also know by tracking ICS attacks, even recent ones like Pipe Dream that we're going to talk about later, we do see that the attacks are not just malware. There's a common theme of malware being used for access, but abuse of interaction of control systems and an abuse of protocols and software already inside the industrial control environment that are legitimate, that are abused. So For our scenario, we have this. Here is our scenario. Engineering teams are troubleshooting a control system network issue. They're observing unusual ICS protocol traffic in the environment. It could be OPC, it could be 104, Modbus TCP, DMP3, or whatever other protocols that you're using primarily in your control environment. So again, try to make this specific to your environment as we're kind of going along. In addition to this, the engineers also indicate that there's unusual network traffic or possible scanning of OPC services. Automatically, you're thinking there's an engineering process of troubleshooting that's ongoing right now, but it could be related to a cyber attack. Really fortunate for us, the engineering team is really well knit into the ICS cybersecurity folks as well. So they communicate all this information out to us. So there's also unexpected connections from the critical asset, which is the engineering workstation, into the PLCs out in the field on legitimate ports and protocols. So not malware, but abuse of control system protocols and traffic in the environment. Now, an example of this is the crash override framework we've seen a number of years ago in 2016, but more recently this year is the release of information and intelligence on pipe dream, a type of framework for ICS targeting not only just one particular protocol or one specific software package seen in the ICS, but this is now two pieces, the second piece of a scalable ICS targeted multi-asset and protocol abuse framework that can be utilized not only just in one sector, but across many sectors. So what about the discussions that will start off as we have this scenario unfolding? Now, the people you have around the table will become extremely important. And one of the discussion points will be around, okay, we have information on the abuse of native protocols in the environment. Do we actually have a list of the ICS legitimate protocols we expect to be in the environment? The question will be raised around the table of, do we have a baseline of the TCP connections we have, Modbus TCP connections? Do we have a baseline going to and from devices? And do we have anything going out aside those? So anomalous abuse in the environment. Beyond that, of course, is critical, right? As we talked about before, the ICS visibility, having network visibility at the control system level. So not high in the Purdue, but level 0 to level 3 to get all the control traffic from HMIs to the field devices and so on. Again, in this point here, observations from the engineering operators on the human-machine interface can be extremely valuable. They can understand what they're seeing that could be odd on the actual view or loss of control or possible manipulation of control on the actual machines to change the process as well. Now, specifically the teams, including the operators, there's the engineering folks, which can also include the process control engineers, also the field engineers, responsible for things like maintenance and programming of the PLCs in the field. You want their feedback, you want their input as we go through an incident response kind of tabletop to understand if there was or was not an unauthorized or authorized change in the field. Beyond that, obviously, security is going to be important. So the ICS security team is going to be on that tabletop call or in the room, and also the ICS network architects, and of course, IT security as well. Going back to threat intelligence indicates in an incident response situation, a commonality is seeing an IT environment get compromised first as a stage 1 to a stage 2 attack in the ICS cyber kill chain. Safety should also be at the table. So on-site physical safety folks, as well as that emergency response team we talked about. There also could be an ability for an external authority that you may be in contact if you have critical infrastructure, obviously, like local police and law enforcement and so on. At least having the contacts for those people available and on hand is going to be critical during a tabletop. Now, always, wherever you can, include management as well. They'll quickly understand those benefits of communication and awareness of the attacks that we are seeing potentially, and the areas we may be able to look forward to close gaps in the future. So management from a VP of engineering perspective, also on-site owner and asset operator as well for the site should be at the table, or at least understand the outcome from these tabletops. So as we pivot into the tabletop, we're going to talk about different aspects of incident response we've covered in prior episodes. As well as we conclude this subsection of ICS Defense Force, we will drop in a link later as well to the entire section or series we have for this type of conversation. So as we pivot into detection and identification, This is where we're going to have trained ICS cybersecurity folks looking at the network. Visibility pops up again as a requirement to really understand what's happening in the network to identify the threats we're seeing. So that's a common theme you will see. And when we talk about network security monitoring, control system access at the full packet capture level would be ideal. If that's not feasible in your environment, that could be a gap as you go through the tabletop, but at least try to get your IP fix or flow data, also called your 5-tuple data. Deploying resources at this particular time now during detection and identification to acquire evidence is critical. You want to understand where that scanning may be coming from, and that will identify and scope out your environment of which assets could be infected at this particular time. Of course, when you do your evidence acquisition, you're going to be capturing memory from those critical identified ICS assets that have been previously identified. The human-machine interface, the data historian, engineering workstation is a critical asset here because we are seeing unusual attack traffic from the engineering workstation to the PLCs in the field. So that is a source already identified for us to capture memory from. In addition to that, where we don't typically get memory from a PLC, because the PLCs are potentially compromised here, or at least involved in some of the malicious or odd traffic, we do want to understand if there were any changes in the logic recently. That means you're going to download or get copies of the production project files or logic files from the controllers. Beyond that, we do probably have a number of endpoint events that we're going to take off some of those specific ICS assets as well. Now, as we have the data acquisition completed and the evidence collected, of course, we're pivoting into the timely analysis. So for those tech folks out there, this is where you do memory analysis on the affected assets. And yes, volatility can be utilized here as well for those memory captures from Linux systems and Windows systems as well. Not so much useful today at all for anything below the top levels of the Purdue, but specifically those higher level Purdue items running traditional operating systems, critical. Now, the analysis of the PLC code typically helped out with the engineering folks. Again, they're going to be part of that tabletop conversation. They're going to have the technical ability to walk down what's in production on the PLCs, but also determine what is different in production versus the known good project files or a safe backup that you can trust. And then determining where the changes may be in the PLC could help determine what the adversary may or may not have done in this particular case. Now, analysis of the scanning of unexpected network traffic as well. So looking at the deep packets where you can to understand how the protocols in this case have been abused. We know that OPC may have been abused, and also those other protocols you expect as well, DNP3 and so on, which is a theme we're seeing of living off the LAN more so the last number of years. And Pipedream, again, is no exception there, where it does tailor its communication to protocols and ports that are normal operation inside the ICS, but using that for nefarious purposes. We can't ignore, of course, the ICS SIEM or OT SIEM as well, security events correlated in there. And also we need to get timely analysis of any remote access. So that's anything from a vendor connection that's possibly compromised, anything that comes into level 3.5 as a jump box connection, but anything as well to an RDP session to an HMI or engineering workstation, again, commonly abused. If we push to containment and eradication, what can you learn from the last number of steps in this scenario of systems being abused natively in the environment? The analysis we have done through memory capture, through network visibility, critical. We can do things like block the discovered C2s, also blocking possible executables if there were any at all, which may not be on traditional operating systems. Again, more of the abuse of internal systems living off the LAN, but also from that we could make network changes for the containment. So we'll be very clear here, we can possibly, depending on safety, shut off parts of the zones inside the network, but again, we have to consider safety, and that's in an upcoming slide to walk you through what would lead us to an actual shutdown in the environment. Suffice it to say, making some network changes could be possible, access control lists on firewalls and switches as an example. Disabling any remote access could be detrimental, but also possibly to contain the threat. Removing access from external environments such as to IT and to and from the internet can also save your environment, which leads us into understanding and having a pre-positioned cyber safe position, which we've covered in previous episodes. When you're faced with containment, obviously the next phase will be eradication. And eradication in the ICS, no surprise here, we're fighting through the attack, which means you have the opportunity to immediately remove the threat from the environment, which may cause disruption in the ICS. Possibly as well, you may need to consider safety, of course, and pushing out full eradication, removing all of the threat, even though it's contained, to the next maintenance window that's basically authorized by the engineering staff, operations prioritized by safety. So the overall event or response here is following a documented ICS IR plan, having it executed to guide the teams that have the communicated roles and responsibility of who will be doing data acquisition. And I know you've probably heard this example before, but it's so true. During an incident response, is it always the ICS security team doing data acquisition, as an example? In a lot of cases, we rely on engineers and the teams and the relationships we've built with those folks during on-site events or tabletops to do some of the data acquisition for us as we're getting to site to do the timely analysis. So critical there. As well, as you go through to do your evidence acquisition and your timely analysis, that phase of incident response for ICS will determine where the adversary is in the ICS kill chain. This, of course, allows us to think about the ramifications of stopping the adversary sooner or later, making changes to the environment or the threat sooner or later, considering the escalating factors towards a possible plant shutdown. So I want to be very clear on this. The first thing we do in ICS incident response is not take a system offline, wipe it, patch it, put it back into production. It's commonly fighting through the attack, which means we have to understand, as we see the threat, what are our options. So for example, these are some of the things that could escalate us towards an actual full plant shutdown or critical system shutdown to preserve safety. So something like malicious code, unauthorized access detected in the ICS, are coming towards the ICS is definitely cause for concern. Incident response should be kicked off in any one of these particular phases. However, the ones in the blue here, even including external or exfiltration of sensitive data, does probably not warrant a shutdown of the system, causing more damage than the malicious actor that you're seeing specifically so far. Loss of visibility in the center here and the loss of possible control of the process really hints at maybe you don't have access to the environment now, should you consider a shutdown in this particular case. And as of course, as we pivot to the complete loss of the process, now we're talking about possible safety ramifications, manipulation of the control environment as well. Again, loss of control and possible physical damage or physical assets being damaged or safety concerns to people at the plants. This last three for sure is where you want to really consider possible shutdown of the environment if you have an intrusion at that deep level in the environment, which, good news, doesn't usually happen overnight. So here's where we have incident response kicked off in every one of these phases, but the last three really kind of prioritizing safety and asking that question, is it safe to shut down the system now, or do we continue fighting through the attack? Again, can't say it enough, prioritizing safety. So how do you make all of this successful? How do you make a tabletop successful? Obviously, lessons learned, but if you do have these two main things in place, it will actually drive your ICS incident response very, very well. And leaders will love to see that you have these in place for high return of investment. So if you have a fully documented ICS inventory of what assets are in there, you can couple that up with ICS threat intelligence to determine what the vulnerabilities are, what the TTPs are used by the adversary to understand what your risk surface is on a regular basis. Beyond that, again, the common pattern, network security monitoring, having network visibility at the control system level, as we talked about, is critical to drive that ICS incident response. Without both of these two in the yellow area here and the orange area, then the incident response is really not going to be near as streamlined, again, causing further ramifications, possibly to safety, production, and financial impact as well. So what I want to do is have a very quick conversation, and as we go, a reminder as well to pop any questions that you have in the comment section. I want to get to those in probably 3 slides from now. So looking forward to any questions that you guys have. So lessons learned. Now the thing here is I really want to talk about the differences between TTPs rather than IOCs. We know that IOCs are definitely helpful during an incident, but to be proactive, we're going to focus mostly on TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures to be proactive. So as an example, focusing only always on IOCs is really kind of playing whack-a-mole. You see one threat, you change one thing in the environment or scope, and then you see a one-to-one relationship of your effort versus the, I guess, return you're going to get. When we talk about defense in depth or TTPs as an example, we really see a relationship of one change in your environment can actually kick out n number. So that's n number of adversaries in the environment. So as an example, on screen, you see a mapping of MITRE attacks. Some of these common things we are seeing ICS specific targeted attacks going for are things like living off the land, scripting in the environment, possible supply chain as well, using valid accounts, also gravitating towards graphical user interface, SCADA hijacks, and so on and so forth. So if you remove the ability for the adversary to take advantage of these legitimate functionality in the ICS without impeding the ICS, then it's more proactive. It's more one-to-N versus one-to-one. So some of the common questions you want to ask yourself during an incident response or even prior or after is the readiness. So questions to drive the ICS IR actions are as follows. So resilience against ransomware. Could they impact safety and loss of operations by a ransomware attack that typically today, at least, are focusing on traditional operating systems only? This ties right into the last one on the bottom right, which is possible to run the industrial control process in manual mode, completely isolated away from IT, the internet. If you can isolate your environment and run in manual mode without traditional operating systems, you may be in a better place than what you may have initially understood. It goes back again to the critical assets identified and regularly monitored, the ICS critical assets which we covered in the past, but also the ability to detect these threats of living off the land. You're not detecting just malware now, you're detecting the abuse of the control system itself. So this is a quick run through of a tabletop you can use in your environment, but as you progress and mature your environment, you can create your own ICS incident response scenarios as well. Of course, you can start with the scenarios we talked about here, but also leverage specific threat intelligence from your sector, customize as well to suit your needs, which means you probably know of some gaps in your environment already. And to help justify closing those gaps from internal audits, even external assessments and compliance aspects, you can pivot your scenario based on what you found previously, which is a great move forward to progress and mature your program. Keep in mind safety at every step, and I can't say this enough, involve as many teams as you can to get that benefit of awareness, team and relationship convergence, and so on and so forth. And of course, goes without saying, include your top critical ICS assets. But not to worry, there are resources out there that help you, and there is one resource here, which is the ICS Incident Response Poster. It actually walks you through guidance on preparing for and actually performing incident response in a control system environment. So it walks you through some of the elements we talked about, the cyber safe position, what that means, how do you execute it. Also talks about the steps in detail of incident response, the ICS and IT differences as well, fortifying the mission of ICS being different than an IT. It also speaks about the details of where the adversary could be in the kill chain when you do detection and identification, and suggests things you can do based on where you find the adversary. So hopefully we'll have this popped in, a banner there shortly, which is great. But I will pause here for any questions that you have. So let's pivot over to the live stream to see if there's any questions. All right, so first of all, I got lots of comments, which is great. So I'll take the first one. So the first one here, is there also a place for ICS vendor in the exercise, or what and when should they require to be involved? Fantastic question. I would say that yes, there is absolutely a way to have the vendors included here. And you hit on something really important. We do see a lot of vendors being relied on for things like logic code. So when we talk about PLCs before, we talked about downloading the PLC code and looking for that known good file. A lot of times the vendor has a copy of that. And in fact, we may not have a copy. That's reliance for sure. So to answer your question, I would say yes, it's really important to include vendors if you have the ability for them to be in the tabletop. And the tabletop doesn't have to be super long to start. 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 days planning it, and actually the execution could be maybe a half a day or a day long, right? So you can absolutely have your vendor there possibly for that. Great question. All right, sounds good. Yeah, thanks for putting out the poster there as well. So it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this content, and I do want to thank you for joining us for the ICS Defense Force, and looking forward to talking with you guys again soon.